So this is Resident Evil 4 HD Ultimate Edition, as Capcom are touting it on the internet. Crikey, that is a mouthful by most regards. And this is the second time that Resident Evil 4 has been given a PC port. The original PC port was published by Ubisoft in 2007, and that version was, and still is, an absolute joke. For whatever reason, Capcom, in their infinite wisdom, decided to use the inferior PS2 version as the means for creating the PC version. I have no idea why they would do that, considering the original GameCube version looked and played better than the PS2 version. It made sense when Capcom were actually porting the game to the PS2 in the first place. It made sense that they had to make concessions to make the game run on the PS2 because it had less processing power to work with, and of course, you know, they had to reduce the lighting effects and reduce the amount of polygons on the screen and so on to make the game run properly on the console, and that's perfectly fine. The PS2 version runs and plays nicely, and there's no problem with the things they've taken out in terms of graphical fidelity on that version. But there was absolutely no excuse, you know, even in 2007 there was no excuse for Capcom to use that version as the basis for the PC port, but that's what they did, and that's what became of it. That version was full of bugs, it looked terrible, it just didn't work properly, it was full of bugs, the controls were god-awful, and it was an absolute joke. Even when like the fan community like released patches and mods for it, it still didn't work properly, and it was still a god-awful version of the game. And this is the second time that Capcom have given Resident Evil 4 a PC port, and I'm glad to say that this version is way better than the original PC port. That said, this is not the best version of Resident Evil 4 that's out there, even though they explicitly state, Capcom explicitly state that this version is the best version you can get of it, and it's not. It's simply not true in its current state. It's still a very good version of the game, don't get me wrong, but let me just put it this way. This version of the game feels like what the original PC port of the game should have been like, if that makes sense. It kind of feels pedestrian in 2014 for a HD upgrade, especially when you consider that the game is nearly 10 years old now. While the upgrades, don't get me wrong, are nice additions to this version of the game, it does have a few problems, of course. The HD upgrade is very nice. Well, you know, Capcom didn't really, in fairness, didn't really have to do all that much to make the game look better than they already did. It looked fantastic on the GameCube. All they had to do was spruce up the textures, and that's what they have done. But that's about it, really. Aside from this 60 frames per second upgrade, there's not much really incentive to really play this game again, especially in my case when I've played it like 400 billion times all the way through. It's still a really good, it's still a good version of the game. It just feels a little bit lazy, if you ask me. The game should run at 60 frames per second, which it does most of the time. That's one of the issues I have with it. It does have frame rate issues, unfortunately. In certain areas, especially areas like this one where I'm playing now, the frame rate, I did notice the frame rate dropping to less than 30 frames per second. Now, I am playing on an i7 processor machine with a GTX 7 series graphics card with 2 GB of memory, so there's no excuse for this game to drop at all less than 60 frames per second on a machine of this power. You don't need a particularly powerful machine to run this version of the game. You only need a dual-core processor to run it smoothly, as it says in the system requirements at recommended settings. It's just, you know, it's just a little bit disappointing, really. 60 frames per second is nice, but it's disappointing when the game does drop below that frame rate. The HD upgrade is very nice. The textures still look very nice. It's just like, you know, they could have spruced it up a little bit more, really. At least they haven't spoilt it. That's one thing, you know. They've used the original textures. They haven't really spoilt them, which is nice. It plays nicely for the most part, but it does have a few anomalies aside from those things. I did notice a few animation errors, especially when what weapon I noticed that has a problem. If you try and reload the standard sniper rifle, when you try and reload it, the reload animation slows down for whatever reason. I haven't noticed on any other weapon so far, but I have noticed a few anomalies like that crop up frequently. It's a decent version, don't get me wrong. It's got all the extras of the PS2 version, including the Assignment Ada and the Mercenaries mini-games, and you've got the option to play with mouse and keyboard controls if you so wished. If you've got an Xbox 360 or a PlayStation 3, then go for those versions instead, really, because there's, the only reason you want to play this version is for the 60 frames per second upgrade, and the texture upgrades as well. But those two things on their own aren't really enough, really, to justify it. The PC mouse controls just don't work very well, and unfortunately you can't really bind any of the keys as far as I can tell. Stuff like that. It's just a really generic upgrade. It's just like they've taken the GameCube version, which is already really solid, and give it a small lick of paint. They haven't really done much to the original code. They just left it as it is and released it. And you know, at least they have, you know, they just haven't done anything to it. You know, it's just what it would have been nice if, like, they've thrown in extra stuff like, for example, like extra difficulty settings, because especially when I've played this game through hundreds and billions of times already on previous versions, it's just even professional difficulty is far too easy, if you ask me, because you soon find out where all the pitfalls are. You know how the gameplay works. You know how to conserve ammo, and not you know, another difficulty level would have been nice, really, if they'd thrown that in there. Some of the textures look a bit weird as well, I've noticed. While it still looks very nice, some of the textures look remarkably low res for what they are. Some of the textures look great, some of them look a bit naff, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. It looks good overall, but if you look closely, some of the textures, like, just, you can tell that Capcom haven't really done anything to them, really, apart from, like, stretch them further. But there you go. It's a bit disappointing, really, Resident Evil 4 HD Edition. It's a fantastic game. It's a decent port. It's just a lazy port. And if you've got an Xbox or a PlayStation already, which most of you will have already, then get those versions instead, because there's not much here to really justify getting it again on the PC. It just feels a little bit lackluster, unfortunately. So it's kind of hard to recommend. So for most people, I'd give it a miss.